So the so-called Vinland Sagas, that's Eric the Red Saga and the Greenlanders Saga, with their accounts of the settlement of Greenland and the abortive expedition to the coast of North America, speak the age in which they're written. They speak to 13th century Icelanders whose incipient national pride in the achievements of their ancestors was complicated by a strong sense of not sharing the same beliefs and attitudes of the age in which the narratives take place. A close examination of how both sagas situate the failure of Norse adventurers to establish a foothold in North America has much to tell us about how the saga writers positioned their work as part of a larger, what in rhetorical terms we call ethos-centered rhetorical project, in which human motivation is in itself significant. Both texts face the challenge of taking the clearly inglorious defeat of the Vinland adventurers and finding in it something which redeems the key participants, especially the Icelanders Thorfinn Karlsefni and Gudrid Thorbjorn, daughter, as ideal ancestral types whom the sagas can celebrate, and who are in fact, we'll see it celebrate other records as well. A close look at the text, Rhetoric, with particular emphasis on how each one constructs ethos across a continuum of locations, reveals a clear motivation to see the decision to abandon Vinland as a repudiation of what I'll call the Viking warrior ethos in favor of a quote-unquote modern values rooted in Christianity and favoring close cultural and economic ties with the emergent Western European mainstream. The saga's rhetorical agenda involves a careful handling of ancestral reputations to establish how good ethos, defined in the Aristotelian sense of goodwill, good character, and good judgment, resides not in sailing over the horizon to confront unknown dangers, but in building a secure society at home in Iceland. In effect, the sagas tell us that while Karlsefni and Gudrid are unquestionably brave in venturing west, the wisdom they display in ultimately returning home to Iceland, the eastward turn, is the greater virtue. Now, earlier scholars have noted certain rhetorical elements in these sagas. Of particular relevance is Ólafur Halldórsson's argument that Eric's saga in particular was written to, and I'm quoting here, boost the lineage of Bishop Björn Gilson, one of Karlsefni's descendants, at a time when his canonization was sought. And Birgit North Wallace also notes that Haukar, the compiler of the Hauk's book, which contains a version of Eric's saga, was also a direct descendant of Karlsefni and Gudrid. It isn't difficult to locate the celebration of these individual reputations within a larger kind of proto-national project aimed at boosting the individual reputations within a larger context of the annals of Northern history. The motivation which Halldórsson describes suggests that the Vinland sagas can be read as exercises in what Canadian rhetorician Maurice Charlin has termed constitutive rhetoric, which borrows Louis Althusser's term interpellation, that is, getting an audience, approaching an audience, interpellating an audience as participants in a discourse predicated on their engagement in creating a narrative, in this case of the ancestors, which their own, the audience's that is, subsequent behavior must complete or bring to perfection. Charlin identifies three what he calls ideological effects necessary to this constitutive rhetoric, each of which is discernible in the Vinland sagas as the scholarship on their rhetorical or pragmatic function have approached them. The sagas can be seen as urging their audiences to, first of all, constitute a collective subject. In this case, from the perspective of 13th century Icelanders, subject as Norse-speaking people from Norway to Iceland. I'm going to draw the line at Iceland, leaving Greenland aside, whose Christian identity permits further identification as Christian Europeans, distinct from foreigners, particularly such as the Skrællingar of Vinland, but also, more problematically, with Norse-speaking Greenlanders. Second, constitutive rhetoric asks that we posit a transhistorical subject, specifically the ancestors whose actions establish the parameters of identity as practiced in matters of faith and culture. The figures of Karlsefni and Gudrid become examples of these kinds of ancestors, as we shall see. Thirdly, constitutive rhetoric seeks to promote what Charlin calls the illusion of freedom, to, in this case, choose a common destiny. In this case, we see the decision of the Vinland adventurers to abandon the lands to the west of Iceland as an affirmation of identity, rather than as defeat, rather than kind of a blot on reputation, which in turn offers a model for choosing a Christian Western European identity for Iceland in the later centuries at, as I've said, the expense of a quote-unquote Viking one. Charlin's theory follows earlier rhetorical theorists in situating the effects of his rhetoric not in overt rational persuasion. I'm writing this to make you very, very specifically do this one individual thing. But rather, as his term ideological and ideological effects suggests, the emphasis rests in the cultivation of an attitude which predisposes an audience, and I think this is something we can take across a broad historical span of readership, to the acceptance of some behaviors and to the rejection of others as part of the reading experience. A similar approach, which also contextualizes this sense of the audience, the engaged audience of these kind of texts across historical time, is to be found in an essay called The Second Persona by rhetorical theorist Edwin Black, who argued that in addition to recognizing a distinction between a literal author and an authorial persona, very useful distinction to make in the case of the sagas where we know little about actual writers in many cases, readers should distinguish between the text's acknowledgement of actual readers on one hand and its addressed to a kind of ideal reader on the other. This ideal reader, the second persona of Black's title, is the reader the text's rhetorical strategies seek to persuade the actual reader to become. We've already referred to Halldorsson's work on the original political context. Also, as Carol Clover has demonstrated in the medieval saga, we can use our knowledge of medieval rhetorical practice, as evinced in the structure of the sagas, to reconstruct key expectations inherent in medieval literacy in Iceland regarding form. From the point of view of a critic following Black, however, these approaches give us what today we would call the demographic, not the second persona, not the individual reading, interpreting consciousness to whom the author addresses rhetorical activity, an audience who is or can be predisposed to act on the discourse, in this case to contextualize the overall effect of the Greenland expansion in general as an ethical matter, which can, as I've said, be cast in more positive terms than might appear to be the case at face value. So a Blackian reading of the text's rhetorical strategy involves examining how the audience is invited, or again, interpellated, to see the whole Vinland adventure as ethically unsound from its own prehistory on. Its unsoundness actually begins before anything happens or starts. Black's theory provides a framework for the identification and examination of signals in the text, which orient the potential reader's response around various anthematic assumptions, in rhetorical terms, the unspoken, quote-unquote, common sense assumptions that sort us out, this is doable, this is not, this is practical, this is not, which locate the acts and choices of characters within what I'll describe as an ethical hierarchy. The hierarchy subordinates traditional Viking values of physical courage and the desire to seek independence beyond the reach of established authority to European values rooted in the fusion of Christian, feudal, and mercantile imperatives. So the cultural shift east involves a shift to those values. A reading of these texts, as approaches the kind of rhetorical audience construction that I'm discussing here, is that of Robert Kellogg, who, in his 1999 essay, The Vinland Sagas, Romance and Conversion, Kellogg addressed the literary context for both these texts, seeing both Eric's saga and the Greenlander saga in the context of the romance genre, with a specific focus on the conventions of the conversion narrative. Kellogg makes a convincing argument for the saga's deployment of their exotic setting, complete with, unipeds, one-legged, archers who hop around the wilderness in Vinland and things like that, other supernatural phenomena of that kind, and also the opposition of Christian and pre-Christian beliefs in their plots as a kind of localized adaptation of the romance, which also affirms a Christian ethos as a basic characteristic of culture in Iceland, as the authors of these two texts wished it to be seen. Now, this paper doesn't take issue with Kellogg's interpretation, which is valid from the standpoint of genre. And genre, of course, has rhetorical implications, shaping our expectations. Kellogg doesn't specifically address rhetoric or rhetorical theory as a context for his investigation, but his reasoning follows Halldórsson in noting the text's political, persuasive, or propagandistic dimensions that I've referred to earlier. This paper does, however, diverge from the course set by Halldórsson and Kellogg in shifting the focus away from establishing the recognizable generic conventions and their attendant tropes, which allow us to map these sagas in literary terms in the immediate historical context of the era when the text was set down. Here, this analysis is concerned with how the texts generate the preconditions for the overt literary, religious, or political persuasion which other scholars have traced. So kind of what makes that kind of persuasion or rhetorical practice possible. By examining how the Vinland sagas serve as exercises in what rhetorical theorist Kenneth Burke called the coaching of an attitude in the reader, my analysis will examine how the texts effectively contain and foreclose on the viability of Western exploration as an ethical pursuit. Showing the text, how the text thus configure ethos, will provide insights into the ideology of the texts that are very much concerned with human behavior and the problem of reconciling conflicting historical understandings of virtue. In doing so, it will potentially, and this is something for later research, it will reveal something of the mindset which marginalized and neglected the Greenland settlements later in history, and ultimately relegated Vinland to the status of myth. My examination relies on the following premises drawn from traditional contemporary rhetorical theory. First, I'll argue the texts are implicitly concerned with its establishing the ethos of Karlsefni as models. Secondly, the analysis follows Kenneth Burke's insistence on identification as the prime mover of rhetorical activity, as essential to understanding how the text's cultivation of a shared attitude between rhetor, writer, sagaman, and reader is a precondition to any actual persuasion to thought or action. In both our texts, the reader is prompted to respond to the lands west of Iceland in uncertain, ambiguous terms, and language suggestive of social, religious, or even natural order that pertain particularly in Iceland are withheld, from the descriptions of those places. So, the motivation of conflicting attitudes, the cultivation of conflicting attitudes toward Greenland and Vinland on one hand and towards Iceland on the other, are in turn legible in light of another Aristotelian concept which I want to use here. And that is entelechy, defined from Aristotle's work on as understanding something in terms of the perfection or completeness natural to its kind. Distinct from teleology, we're not talking about cause and effect, entelechy was embraced by rhetoricians such as Burke because of the way its amenability to rhetorical activity provided a means to discuss the way that creating a perception of something for an audience, creating perception of something in light of some ultimate form or manifestation of it, a potential form of it, has a powerful impact on an audience response to any given phenomenon that seems to be leading up to that. So establishing not only dangerous, remote, however exotic Vinland, but also Greenland as effectively futureless, whose what I'll call intellectual trajectory, what it can be, amounts to a kind of futureless space, an unthinkable space, predisposes an audience to a dim view of even the most courageous action which have those places as a constraining scene or stage, and casts the act of turning away from them as ethically sound. We can approach the text deployment of entelechy through Burke's theory of what he calls perspective by incongruity. Now, Burke offers a framework in a number of his books written back in the 30s, Permanence and Change and Attitudes Towards History in particular, which demonstrates how the authors, we use the theory, Burke doesn't write about the Sagas specifically, we use the theory to create a framework which demonstrates how the author of these sagas very carefully prepare the reader, prepare this, culture and attitude, as I've said, in the reader for the protagonist's decisions. So the reader inevitably sees the action as the culmination of a larger positive ethos building process that occurred across several generations in both sagas. Both Eric's saga and the Greenlander saga, pay close attention to incongruity between the characters' motivations and actions on one hand with the territories in which they operate, to point the way towards those actions which permit the acceptance of kind of integrity of ethos for Karlsefni and Gudrid, whose actions provide our ethical compass. Without, and this is an important point, without submitting those specific characters' own actions to much scrutiny. In fact, cultivating an attitude which, increasingly casts the Western countries as negative, forms our sense of the protagonist's ethos more than the characters' deeds do. They are ethical by default because we constantly see them against a kind of absence of ethos in Greenland and in Vinland. Burke argues that a rhetor's attitude to the subject matter is revealed in the slippage between a thing and the signs used to communicate it. He uses actually the word perspective as a way of talking about metaphor, indicating that the essential unlikeness of the tenor and vehicle of the metaphor invite rhetorical activity and invite the audience to resolve that unlikeness. Why can I use this one thing to explain another? What kind of things do I have to do to kind of make these things merge symbolically, as he puts it. So in the Vinland sagas, this incongruity, perspective by incongruity, unfolds in several contexts. The most important of which involving how Greenland and Vinland are mapped into the saga narrative as what Burke terms the scene, in which brings that ethical behavior constrained in different ways depending on where the characters are. Iceland one way, Greenland another, Vinland a third. The normative or foundational narrative that Burke would call the representative anecdote in these sagas is the settlement in Iceland of Oyler the Deep-Minded in Greenlander's saga, and her subsequent manumission of her slave Vifot, grandfather of Gudrid. Now Oyler, or Linner as she's called, I think, in Laxdale saga, well-known brother texts. In this particular text, she frees Gudrid's grandfather, the slave from Scotland, I believe, Vifot, and assures him that his quality will always be recognized. He kind of asks, why are you not giving me a farm like everybody? He says, well, I just feel that everywhere you go, people will recognize what a good character you are, you will profit without my help. And this is a scene that seems to extend down his family line, to Gudrid and beyond. Now, Iceland, in this sense, is idealized in the Vinland sagas as a place which attracts settlers of good character who choose it for sound reasons of personal independence and prosperity, in these two saga texts. Its Christianity in these texts is either established or at least imminent, and its relationship with the mainland and British Norse communities are constructive. So given this profile, the characterization of the volatile characters like Eric the Red or even Gudrid's father Thorbjorn is immediately problematized, because while their behavior as violent or merely disruptive would be normalized perhaps in other sagas, in these ones they appear more as malcontents who are perhaps best suited to a frontier, kind of outside of quote-unquote polite society. So the Greenland, where Eric the Red settles, always seems a little less promising than Iceland, despite its resources. From Eric's decision to call it by a euphemistic name, people are more likely to follow me to Greenland than to Glacierland, than to Rockland, or any of the names they kind of hang on certain parts of North America. To the chronic references to shipwreck, famine, and disease, Greenland is characterized in terms which are perhaps a more realistic take on the settlement experience, which also established Greenland as an inferior rhetorical scene for a narrative about self-realization, which the sagas point themselves towards being. Small details reinforce an attitude towards Greenland as being what I might call intellectually disadvantaged. Basic codes of behavior and hospitality are maintained, but the text contains undercurrents which serve as caveats. Gudrid and her first husband, Thorstein Eriksson, are invited to winter with a farmer called Thorstein the Black, who describes himself in an invitation as unsociable, and who states his lack of Christianity while admitting its superiority. There seems to be kind of cross currents at work in the way these characters talk about themselves and their beliefs, their codes. Eric welcomes Thorfinn Karlsefni as rival in Greenland, and then, after showing some sign of depression, admits that he can't feed him, entertain him in style. Thorfinn actually has to subsidize his own entertainment with the resources he's brought with him. So codes of hospitality, being compromised. The religious character is fundamentally ambiguous, and the Vinland sagas consistently foreground Greenland as at best a marginally Christian society, settled before the conversion of Iceland, and thus even when quote-unquote Christianity was still young in Greenland, it seems to be growing from a bad seed. Pre-Christian rites are still preserved and practiced, and the leading citizen, Eric the Red, is described in Eric's saga as slow to convert, and the church at his farm is not too near their house. And in the Greenland saga of the Greenlanders, he's described as dying unconverted. His son, the less than saintly Leif Erikson, charged with converting Greenland by King Olaf Tryggvason of Norway, accepts the commission while adding that he thought this mission would be a hard one to carry out in Greenland, and a comment which is similar to formula used elsewhere to express commitment to lost causes, such as unrealistic marriage proposals, things like that. He's kind of, he's a missionary, but kind of only because he has to, in some regards. Christian burial is a fraught matter, reference being made to procedures for dealing with burial in consecrated ground. And the unquiet dead, who appear in many other sagas, seem less surprising in these texts, part of an overall blurring of the line between life and death, between the natural and the supernatural. Moreover, they seem associated on some level with sensuality. In Eric's saga, the dying Thorstein Eriksson complains that his host's dead wife is trying to get into bed with him. While in the Greenlander's saga, the equivalent figure merely tries to get out of her own bed, but at the same time, in that saga, Gudrid is required to sit on Thorstein the Black's lap in order to talk to her dead husband, Thorstein Eriksson, to receive information about the future, where he prophesies that she will go and be Christian and live a proper Christian life in Iceland. Now, the incongruity between the virtues, implied or real, of Gudrid and to a lesser degree Karlsefni on one hand, and the ambivalent ethos of their Greenlandic contemporaries comes to a head in the famous scene in Eric's saga where Thorbjörg, the little prophetess, as she's called in some translations, calls on Gudrid, Christian Gudrid, to help her in the rituals. And Gudrid doesn't want to, so I'm a Christian woman. Now, it's not just about the opposition of, quote-unquote heathenism and Christianity, but Gudrid knows the material, is unwilling to participate in ethical grounds, and Thorbjörg, rather ironically, but obliquely, engages Gudrid's Christian virtue of charity and says, you could help other people if you kind of compromise your own principles here. And that is what sways her in this regard. Virtue cannot unfold through conventional doctrinal channels in Greenland, and only the incongruity of the situation brings that so clearly out. So Greenland, mapped as a space where conventional virtues and values exist in a distorted or compromised form, threatening always to draw the virtuous, and certainly the ambivalent, into the orbit of an entelechy towards the good or away from the bad. Now, the countries to the west, however, are portrayed comparatively as nightmare in ethical terms. They're rich in resources, they're ostensibly available for exploitation, but Vinland is a scene seen from the beginning to be closed to inscription in the kind of narrative which Gudrid's prophesied future, to which I just referred, takes to a logical conclusion. It seems a place where any or all ethical action will be undermined in some way. First sighting it, Rhetorical seems repelled by the land, doesn't want to go ashore, and even refusing to follow his to go ashore is still criticized. And Leif at one point says, "I'm not going to make the same mistake. Basically, I will not be criticized for the same thing that Bjarni was." Leif Erikson may or may not be understood to have undertaken a follow-up expedition to landlord, but prefers to be an absentee landlord to a place called Leifsbúðin. His absence, in some measure, he wants to maintain ownership over the land, but doesn't want to be there, which facilitates his sister Freydis Eriksson's murderous treachery in the Greenlander saga. Vinland's a natural setting for the eccentric German Tyrker, who discovers grapes, and the perverse Thorhatler, who may or may not engage Thor's support in delivering a meal of rotten whale, which sickens the company at one particular point. There's also a dispute over women that breaks out in the 12th chapter of Eric's saga. The social order seems threatened at every point in this frontier community. Now, the encounter with the indigenous peoples, however, brings into focus the essential rhetorical incongruity of the western frontier as a space with core values associated with Iceland, just not going to happen. Painted in the broadest strokes, the people of Sagas called the Skrællingar are both objects of contempt and an insurmountable obstacle. The intruders from Greenland treat them as inscrutable inferiors who can be cheated in trade, killed as a matter of reflex, disregarded as having rights of any kind. And yet this opposition is less diametric than it is incongruous, and here again, than it is incongruous. And here again, the principle of incongruity leads to the text's actual assessment of the problem of Vinland as a futureless ethical space. In many regards, if Greenland and Vinland serve as distorting mirrors for Icelandic values, the Skrællingar can be seen as the ultimate distorting mirror in which the problems of violence, ambiguous religious belief, and the reckless pursuit of wealth are writ large. The description of attempts at communication between the groups, each attempting to read the other's symbolic acts, waving banners one way or another, displaying colored shields, mirrored also in the disproportion inherent to the trade. The Skrælings are willing to trade, furs and things like that, for milk, for a piece of cloth the size of your hand. And, the Greenlanders note this. At once, and also as the Skrælingers' confusion and contempt for Norse technology. They're concerned by an axe which can kill someone but will not break stone. And it's a useless piece of technology, and this again puzzles the Greenlanders. It invites the possibility that we can at once equate the societies because they're coming together over shared technologies, shared problems of communication, and then in making one seem ridiculous, from the point of view of the saga writers, invites the possibility the absurdities are merely part of what I've been calling an intellectual continuum with normal beliefs and practices. There are things that draw flawed elements of what is normal in a negative direction, and this is perceived as the threat of these Western territories. Taking the virtuous Gudrid as a focal point, especially given the risk to her faith that the Greenlandic openness to compromise suggests, we can examine two moments where normative behavior is used to demonstrate her own incongruity with the Vinland setting. The obvious contrast with Freydis Eriksdottir sees the latter as a foil to the former. In the Greenlander saga, Freydis is treacherous, a murderess, and an inciter to murder, making her ruffian father seem a solid citizen by comparison. So we have a sense of, Gudrid does not, follow Freydis' lead. Now, I have lots to say about Freydis, but I'm not going to. I just want to make my final point here. More significant, however, actually, is Gudrid's encounter in the Greenlander saga with the unnamed woman who visits her in her booth in Vinland, a moment which can be understood as a turning point in the text's deployment of incongruity and its frustration of codes. A woman with chestnut hair and large eyes, dressed in a form-fitting garment, enters the booth where Gudrid nurses her infant Snorri. Gudrid's greeting, "My name is Gudrid, what is your name?" meets with the response, "My name is Gudrid." The woman is invited to sit, but a loud noise signals violence outside, and the woman disappears. Now, in this scene, the full divergence between conventional Icelandic order and Vinland emerges. The text's lack of explanation capitalizes on the reader's instincts to fill in the blanks. We probably have a knee-jerk reaction to an apparition whose manifestation is meant to communicate something to people, a double of some kind. However, as Bo Almquist and others have indicated, there's no reason why we cannot accept the episode as naturalistic, given affinities between the text and other descriptions of Skrælingja. And above all, the highly naturalistic detail of someone who, addressed in a strange language, responds by repeating what has been said in the hopes that it is the greeting, in the hopes that it is a polite thing to say. So we have this highly ambiguous moment on this line between realism and the supernatural. Now, in the context of establishing Vinland as a futurist space, with Gudrid as a key witness reference point, we can return to the distorting mirror conceit to see this moment as the extreme of incongruity. The woman mirrors or reflects Gudrid, but in a manner which reveals no information, which gives her back an empty reflection of herself from an unfamiliar face. The violence that occurs at this moment, and the orientation of the rest of the narrative to the Norse withdrawal, supports a rhetorical reading of this moment as completing the formation of an attitude, which positions the Vinland enterprise as not only dangerous and unprofitable, but meaningless, an empty space which begets emptiness. So my final point, Burke describes ambiguity itself as an invitation to rhetoric. When we experience ambiguity, we have to convince ourselves that we understand what's going on. We can see order in it. And he describes this as what he calls the comic corrective. It's, correcting in the navigational sense our view from confusion to certainty. He argues that good criticism is always comic in nature because it's about restoring order. So, if the lack of an intellectual fit between the virtues of Gudrid and the compromised futureless ethical landscape of Greenland and Vinland established the latter as essentially tragic, in that they lead to the dead end of defeat and infamy, or at best to obscure death, casting traditional elements of the heroic ethos, such as violence and ambition, in these negative terms, allows the non-heroic material to fill the ethical void, correcting, in a navigational sense, the saga's narrative orientation towards a larger comic pattern acceptable to an idealized Icelandic audience, who now look east to the European mainland and not to the western horizon for its pragmatic models of social behavior and cultural identity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, John, for that marvellous mapping of ethics. We have time for one question. If anyone would like to ask a question from the floor, I'm sure you can also catch John at coffee. And we have a question. Mark,
just quickly, I'm particularly interested in the fact that you pointed out the fact that the saga appears in Högsbo. I'm just wondering if you can reflect on any thoughts you have about its place in relation to the actual ethical and philosophical texts that also appear in Högsbo, and how perhaps, if it is the text is used for ethical purposes, is there a sense of didactic or educational role, or how would you see it being used?
Okay. Now, some of the way the texts are contextualized now, just at the moment, I'm trying to sort out, what's in scope. I know certainly the Eric Saga text is is located within a life of Olaf Tryggvason, and certainly seen as being something which supplements, if I use my favorite word today, intelligence, in there, that Olaf's life represents, we can kind of see it as operating as an exemplar. This is one of the paths down which one should not be diverted. If one does go down here, we have a couple of safe guides. Gudrid and Grotha need to guide you back, and that kind of thing. I know certainly Halldorsson's extensive work on the textual provenance of the Greenland materials puts a great deal of emphasis on their environment in the larger texts. Now, I'll freely admit that I've only kind of skimmed over the surface of those, partly due to I only read Icelandic very, very slowly, and but it's certainly something I'm aware of wanting to build up as part of a larger project of of seeing kind of how traditional and modern rhetorical theory can I think expand our sense of what reading these sagas, means today, and how reflecting on how they were read and for what purpose they were read, how that works together.
Thank you.
Marvellous.
Okay, thank you.